Before I understood anything about the world, I understood roles. They were not harsh things, not in the beginning. They were more like the walls of a beautiful garden, protective hedges meant to keep out the wild animals. I was born into a Christian home where love and limits breathed the same air. And for a long time, I didn't question which was which.
My father and my mother were not just churchgoers, they were a testimony. They had met in the church choir many years before I was born. My mother told me the story so many times that I can see it as if I were there. The afternoon sunlight slanting through stained glass and the smell of old wooden pews, and my father, a young man with serious eyes, watching her sing a solo and deciding right then that she was the one. They courted properly as the church expected. They prayed together. They set boundaries. My mother would always lower her voice and smile in a particular reverent way when she reached the part of the story where she said, "And throughout our courtship, your father never touched me. On our wedding night, I was a virgin." That phrase, "I was a virgin on my wedding night," was a cornerstone in our home. It was held up like a gleaming jewel, the proof of their righteousness, the reason God had blessed their union. I grew up knowing that my mother's untouched body on her wedding day was not just her private joy, but the family's crown. And I understood, even without being told directly, that the same crown was expected to sit on my own head one day. I am the last of 3 daughters. Sarah, the firstborn, arrived like a sunrise, the one who made my parents' parenting real. 2 years later came Naomi, as if God wanted to confirm the pattern. And then, a full 6 years after Naomi, I appeared. I used to wonder late at night why it took them so long to produce me. Was I a mistake? A surprise they didn't plan? My mother would simply say, "You were worth the wait, Mary," and kiss my forehead. But the gap always whispered to me that maybe I was the child they didn't expect to have, the one who would either be the triple confirmation of their legacy or the one who would test it.
Our home was a small universe governed by clear laws, and those laws were wrapped in love but tied with firmness. We learned them early, the way other children learn nursery rhymes. Dress modestly. A skirt should cover the knee. A blouse should not cling too tightly. Our bodies were temples, and temples do not advertise themselves. No heavy makeup or nail fixing. A little gloss was permitted by the time we were older, but anything that drew attention to the face in a worldly way was gently forbidden. We were to be noticed for our spirit, not painted for the flesh. You must keep your virginity till marriage. This was the golden thread that ran through every rule. It was not simply encouraged, it was the entire purpose of the garden walls. Everything else, the modest dressing, the supervision, the curfew, was just a fence around that one sacred treasure. My mother was the chief guardian of these laws. My father supported her fully, but his way was quieter. He would quote scripture at the dinner table, his deep voice filling the room while we 3 girls sat in a row on the wooden bench, and he would look at us over his reading glasses and say, "A good name is better than riches. Remember that." I didn't know then that he was also saying, "Do not break my name." Growing up, I watched Sarah and Naomi move through these rules with a grace I couldn't quite muster. They seemed to breathe easily inside the garden walls. I loved our home, truly I did, but I also felt a tiny, unnameable restlessness, a wild seed growing quietly beneath the well-tended soil. I tucked it away. Until I turned 16. The inner workings of my own body were a rumor whispered in the school compound, and hastily dismissed by every adult I trusted. I knew vaguely that my body would change. It already had, and I knew that the changes were somehow linked to the keep your virginity rule. But no one had connected the dots for me in plain language. That changed one Saturday afternoon. My mother called me into her bedroom, the inner sanctum where serious conversations happened. She had prepared the room as if for a small ceremony. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon heat. The big family Bible sat on the bedside table, and a single chair had been placed facing the bed. She sat on the edge of the bed, gestured for me to take the chair, and folded her hands in her lap. I remember the scent of her body lotion, something soft and floral, and the way she looked at me, half tender and half tense. "Mary, you are no longer a child," she began. She spoke in Igbo, our heart language, but I'll translate so you can understand. "Your body is a garden that God planted, and very soon men will come and want to enter that garden. It is my duty to teach you how to guard the gate." That was the beginning of my sex education. Guarding the gate. She brought out a worn pamphlet the church had produced. On the cover, a drawing of a lily, untouched. She flipped through the pages and began to explain the mechanics of sex in carefully chosen words. She told me what happens between a man and a woman on the wedding night, how he enters her, how blood can come as a sign that the woman had kept herself pure. She paused and looked at me very directly. "That blood, Mary, is your honor. It is the evidence that you respected yourself, your parents, and God." I sat very still. I could feel heat climbing up my neck. I had questions, so many questions, but her tone made it clear that questions were not invited. This was not a discussion, it was a transfer of sacred knowledge. She went on to describe menstruation in clinical terms, linking it to God's design for childbirth. She warned me about boys, even church boys, who would say sweet things to get into my body. She said they will tell you they love you, they will promise marriage. But a man who truly loves you will wait. Your father waited. Solomon's father waited for his wife. That is the mark of a godly man. At the mention of Solomon, Pastor David's son, my childhood friend, my ears pricked up. I didn't know then why the name affected me, but something stirred. Then came the part that would lodge in my chest like a stone. She stood up, walked to the window, and said in a lower voice, "If you make a mistake, Mary, don't think you can hide it. God sees, and we will see too on your wedding night. A girl who is not a virgin brings shame not only on herself, but on her father's house. It is like throwing dirt on everything your father has built in the church. Do you understand?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I felt fear, a cold, heavy fear, and also a strange loneliness, as if the garden she kept talking about belonged to everyone except me. My body, it seemed, was not my own. It was a family investment. Before I left the room, she gave me a small gift, a purity ring, a silver band etched with a tiny cross. She slid it on my finger and said, "This is your promise. When you meet the man God has chosen, you will give him this ring on your wedding day, and he will know that you waited." I remember walking out of that room and looking at the ring under the corridor light. It was beautiful. It felt heavy, like a handcuff made of grace. I was now a fully informed guardian of my own garden and deeply terrified of failing. The talk had not taught me about love or pleasure or the complex desires that were already beginning to hum beneath my skin. It had only sharpened the edges of the rule. Do not fall, because if you fall alone and you take
everyone down. I never told my mother how that conversation left me. She must have believed she had armed me for the future. And in a way, she had. I carried that talk into every moment with Solomon, carrying it like a warning bell that would ring too late.
If my mother's purity talk was the theoretical lesson, my sisters Sarah and Naomi were the living, breathing case studies. They did not simply follow the family script, they became the script. And every time I looked at them, I saw what I was supposed to become. Sarah, the firstborn, carried authority without effort. She was 2 years older than Naomi, but the distance always seemed greater. She moved through our home with the quiet confidence of someone who had already figured life out. When she gained admission into the university, the church celebrated. Not loudly, because we were not people who shouted, but in the meaningful ways that mattered. Our pastor mentioned her name during the Sunday service and asked the congregation to pray for her. My mother hosted a small dinner for the women's fellowship, and my father walked around with a straight back for a week. At university, Sarah maintained herself. She joined the campus fellowship, attended midweek services, and dated nobody. I remember overhearing her tell my mother one holiday, with that calm smile of hers, "Mommy, I am not in a hurry. God will bring the right man at the right time." My mother had hugged her so tightly that I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Jealousy, maybe, or the fatigue of watching a standard set so high. God did bring the right man. His name was Moses, the son of a prominent elder in the church, a young man with a quiet voice and a firm handshake. When Sarah brought him home, my parents beamed. The two families met, prayers were said, a wedding date was set. Sarah was 24, and on her wedding night, she was a virgin. I knew this because my mother could not stop talking about it. Not in explicit terms, our home didn't do that, but in the coded language of the faithful. My mother said to my father as I sat nearby, and he nodded deeply, his eyes wet with gratitude. That wedding set the bar. It was beautiful and pure, and exactly what the church expected. Sarah wore white like she meant it, and Moses looked at her as if she was a prize he had earned through patience. I was a teenage bridesmaid, dressed in lavender, watching the first of my sisters cross the finish line with her crown intact. I clapped and smiled, and inside I felt the bar rise an inch higher.
Then there was Naomi. If Sarah was the steady flame, Naomi was the quiet storm. She was clever, sharp, and restless in a way our parents found slightly unsettling. When she won a scholarship to study business administration at Metropolia University of Applied Sciences in Finland, the news landed in our home like a shockwave wrapped in blessing. Finland. None of us had even seen snow. My mother cried, partly from joy and partly from the terror of releasing a daughter so far away. My father prayed over Naomi for so long that night that I fell asleep on the couch waiting for dinner. Naomi left Nigeria in a flurry of packing and instructions. She was going to a secular country, a cold one, a place where the garden walls my parents had built around us would be tested by distance and difference. My mother gave her a special talk before her departure. I wasn't in the room, but I could imagine it, and packed a small devotional booklet in her luggage. "Remember whose daughter you are," my father told her at the airport. Naomi nodded, and then she was gone.
But Naomi did not break. She studied hard, graduated well, and built a life in Finland. When she met her future husband, a Ghanaian man who had also moved to Finland for a better future, she made sure to tell us that he was a believer, that they attended a local church together, and that, critically, he respected the rule. They courted properly, they waited, and when Naomi got married, she too was a virgin. I couldn't attend her wedding. It was in Finland and the distance was too great. But my mother flew over and my video called afterwards, her face glowing with emotion. 2 for 2, Mary, she said. Your sisters have set the path. You see, it is possible. She meant it as encouragement. I received it as a verdict. 2 for 2 meant I was the last, the final daughter, the tiebreaker. There was no room for a different story because the pattern had already been proven. I was not just carrying my own honor, I was carrying the weight of a legacy. 2 perfect daughters had marched ahead of me into marriage with their virginity held high, like a trophy, and everyone who knew our family now looked at me with an expectation I could feel, pressing against my chest every time I exhaled.
During those years, I smiled and nodded whenever the topic came up. I wore my purity ring like a good third daughter. I went to church and recited the rules and pushed down the wild seed of restlessness that had been growing since childhood. But somewhere, in a quiet corner of my heart, a fear had taken root. What if I can't do it? What if I am the one who fails? I didn't know then that Solomon, the son of Pastor David, my childhood friend, the boy my mother had once mentioned during the talk, would soon walk back into my life. And with him would come the test that would break the garden walls wide open.
Solomon was not a stranger who walked into my life, but a familiar landmark that had always been there, one I suddenly saw with new eyes when he returned from the United Kingdom. I have known Solomon for as long as I can remember. He is the son of Pastor David, the man whose voice thundered over our congregation every Sunday, and whose name my parents spoke with deep respect around our dinner table. Growing up, Solomon and I were part of the children's church class. We memorized Bible verses together, shared snacks during fellowship picnics, and played tag in the church compound after service, while our parents lingered in endless meetings. Back then, he was just Solomon, the pastor's son, my friend, nothing more. Then, when he was old enough, he left. A university admission took him to the United Kingdom, a place that sounded like another planet to me. For 4 years, Solomon existed only in the occasional news passed through church channels. Pastor David's son is doing well in the UK. He's studying hard. He's making us proud. I would picture him in a land of cold weather and grand buildings, and I would feel a small flush of something I couldn't name. Admiration, perhaps, or the distant pride of knowing someone who had gone so far. But I had no reason to think of him as anything more than an old friend, and I certainly never imagined he would come back and tilt the axis of my world. Then, one Sunday, he returned. I was sitting in the choir stand, trying to focus on the worship, when a ripple of whispers pulled my attention to the back of the church. I turned my head slightly and saw him walking in beside his father. He was no longer the lanky boy I remembered. The UK had sharpened him. He stood taller, dressed with a quiet confidence that felt entirely new. A tailored blazer, a neat haircut, a calm, knowing smile as he scanned the congregation. When his eyes passed over me, they paused, just for a second. But that second was enough to send a strange, warm current through my chest. After the service, the congregation swarmed around him like bees to nectar. Everyone wanted to greet the prodigal son who had returned not in shame, but in glory. I hung back, unsure why I suddenly felt shy. He had been my childhood friend, yet somehow I was nervous to approach him. Before I could decide, he broke away from the crowd and walked straight towards me. "Mary," he said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered, smooth and unhurried. I laughed, a little too loudly, and tried to find somewhere to put my hands. "Look at you," I shot back, my voice betraying my nerves. He laughed, that same easy laugh from childhood, and for a moment the years melted away. We talked briefly that day, small things, catching up on surface details, but I walked home with my heart beating in a rhythm that felt new. That night, as I lay in bed, I allowed myself a secret, foolish thought. What if? What followed was a slow, gentle courtship conducted mostly in the open spaces of church life, when no one could question our righteousness. Solomon started finding reasons to talk to me. He would sit near my family during second service. He would send me messages. Casual things at first, a funny memory from childhood, a question about a Bible passage, and I would read each one several times before replying, carefully shaping my words to sound both interested and innocent. My mother noticed, of course. She noticed everything. One evening, she looked at me with a smile that was half warning and half delight. "Pastor David's son has been paying you attention," she said. "That boy is from a good home, a good, godly home." The unspoken hope hung in the air. If this becomes something, you will be the third daughter to make us proud. Then came the evening Solomon asked me to be my girlfriend. It wasn't dramatic. He had invited me for a walk around the church compound after a midweek service, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. We walked slowly, our steps crunching on loose gravel, and he talked about his plans, his future, his sense that God was calling him to something important. And then he stopped, turned to face me, and said with a sincerity that made my breath catch, "Mary, I've known you my whole life, and I've never met anyone like you. I want you to be my girlfriend. Will you walk this path with me?"
Inside, a chorus erupted. "He is the son of Pastor David. My parents will rejoice. My sisters will nod with approval. The pattern will be complete." But I forced my joy into a calm shape and looked at him seriously. I remembered my mother's talk. I remembered the ring on my finger. And with a steadiness I pulled from deep within me, I spoke the words that had been branded into my soul since I was 16. "Solomon, you know I am a Christian girl from a strict home. If we do this, we must wait. We cannot have sex until after marriage. That is my promise. That is my family standard." I watched his face carefully, searching for the slightest hesitation. There was none. He took my hand gently and looked into my eyes. "I respect that, Mary," he said. "I am a Christian too. I know what is right. I will wait for you." His words were a balm. They were exactly what I needed to hear, and in that moment, all my fears dissolved into pure, bright hope. I said yes joyfully, with my whole heart, believing that I had finally stepped onto the same path my sisters had walked so perfectly before me. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed replaying his words, his face, the gentle pressure of his hand holding mine. I pictured our future unfurling in neat, blessed chapters, a godly courtship, a white wedding in the same church where our parents had married, my father walking me down the aisle, my mother weeping with joy, the entire congregation rising to their feet in applause. I would be the third daughter, the perfect 3 for 3, the legacy sealed. I did not know then that the garden walls which had stood so firmly around my life were already beginning to crack, and I did not know that the very same Solomon who promised to wait would very soon be the one to tear them down and leave me standing in the wreckage.
For 3 months, our relationship bloomed inside the garden walls. Solomon was attentive, charming, and publicly godly. He held my hand when we walked out of church, but only briefly, a modest, acceptable touch. He called me every evening to pray over the phone.
his deep voice asking God to protect our relationship and our purity. My mother smiled whenever his name came up. My father started referring to him in gentle jest as our in-law. I was floating. But beneath the prayers and the public goodness, a quiet tension had begun to build. It revealed itself in the way his eyes lingered on me a little too long after choir practice, in the way his hand sometimes rested on the small of my back when we walked, its warmth burning through my blouse, in the way my own body was beginning to respond to his presence, a flutter, a heat, a curiosity I had been taught to suppress, but never truly felt dead. The garden walls were still standing, but a vine had crept over them, and its flowers smelled intoxicating. One Saturday afternoon, Solomon called me. His voice was casual, light. "Mary, I just got a new television. Come over to my apartment, let's watch a film. It's just Netflix and chill, nothing serious." I knew what people usually meant when they said Netflix and chill. But Solomon wasn't people, he was Solomon. I said, "Okay, I'll come." I dressed simply, jeans and a modest top, my purity ring glinting on my finger. As I walked to his apartment, I replayed my mother's voice in my head. A woman could lose a man and recover, but once she lost her purity, people would never forget. I held the words tightly, like a talisman. I was just going to watch a film, nothing more. His apartment was neat and masculine, with a large television dominating one wall. The curtains were drawn, the room bathed in a soft amber light from a single lamp. It felt like a cocoon, separate from the rest of the world. Solomon offered me a seat on the leather couch, handed me a glass of chilled juice, and sat down next to me. Close, but not inappropriately so. He pressed play on a romantic comedy, and for the first hour we laughed and commented and behaved like the good Christians we were supposed to be. But the air began to change. Midway through the film, his arm stretched along the back of the couch, not quite touching me yet, but close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin. My body tensed slightly, but I didn't move. I didn't want to overreact. He shifted and his hand found my shoulder. His thumb traced a small circle through the fabric of my top. A shiver ran down my spine, a sensation I had never felt before. Not like this, not from a touch so deliberate. "Are you comfortable?" he whispered, his voice low. I nodded, unable to find words. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a warning drumbeat that I chose to ignore. Then his face turned toward mine. His eyes were dark and soft. He kissed me, gently first, then deeper. I had kissed him before, brief and chaste pecks, but this was different. This was a conversation my body understood without my mind's consent. My lips parted, and I kissed him back. The film continued playing in the background, its dialogue fading into noise. His right hand moved. I felt it travel from my shoulder, down my arm, and then rest on my left breast. The sensation was electric, a surge of something hot and terrifying and wonderful all at once. My breath caught in my throat. Somewhere far away, a voice screamed, "Stop! Remember the ring! Remember the blood! Remember the shame!" But the voice was drowned out by the pounding in my ears and the softness of his touch. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're going to get married anyway. Everyone knows it. Your parents, my parents, the whole church. This is just early. We're going to get married anyway." The words were a key that unlocked a door I had been guarding my whole life. I hesitated, one last trembling pause, and then I let go. His right hand found its way down there. The place I had been taught was a sacred garden, sealed until matrimony. The place my mother had described only in whispers and warnings. His fingers walked with a knowledge that should have alarmed me, but instead only deepened my surrender. My body arced towards something it didn't fully understand. And then, with a single motion, he broke through. There was a sharp, brief pain, and then it was done. My virginity, the family's crown, the church's expectation, the proof of my righteousness was gone. He had taken it on a leather couch in a dimly lit apartment with a forgotten film still playing on the screen.
Afterward, I lay still. I felt two emotions rising inside me, side by side, like twins that could not be separated. First, sadness, heavy, cold, spreading through my chest like ink in water. I had broken the rule. I had disappointed my parents, who built their entire reputation on raising pure daughters. I had betrayed my mother, who had wept with joy at Sarah's wedding and called me from Finland with Naomi's victorious news. The purity ring on my finger now felt like a lie. But second, surprisingly, happiness. Because this was Solomon, the son of Pastor David, the man my parents already loved, the man who had promised to marry me. We would not be a scandal. We would be a union celebrated from the pulpit. My mother might even be relieved that the waiting was over, after the wedding, of course. Surely, this was not the failure I had feared. It was just a timeline moved up. God would understand. My parents would never need to know.
I looked at Solomon. He was adjusting his clothes, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked. But the question felt routine, not tender. I told myself I was imagining it. "I'm okay," I whispered. And I smiled because I needed to believe it. I walked home that evening carrying my secret like a fragile glass ball. The world looked the same dusty streets, the same evening call to prayer from a nearby mosque blending with the evening hymns in my head. But I was different. I had crossed a line and I was still standing. In my mind, the story still had a happy ending. Solomon would keep his word, the wedding would come, and my parents would stand before the congregation, the parents of 3 virgin brides, their legacy unbroken. I did not know that in just 2 weeks, I would walk into that apartment and find the happy ending shattered on the floor.